فترة على الضغط. هذا في رينكو ولا شيء. سأجيب لك كرسي على حد رينكو شيء. هيك افتح الميكروفون تبع طفي الميكروفون.
بدك بس هذاك أحلى. بتصير بس تفتح هون وقت صوت هون تعلي لما كمان.
HDMI طالع مني صح؟ طالع مني HDMI.
بدك تفصل.
طفيهم هون. لا ايه احسن. تمام. ايه يس بس اعطيهم الميكروفون عم بيقدر يحضر.
Laura and Vanessa, I'm glad you're with us on Zoom. Sorry to make you wait. So, my name is Joanne Bustani. I'm going to be chairing this session on safeguarding academic freedom, titled What Should Institutions Do? I'll start by, so my background is in history and political science. I am currently a research coordinator at the ACSS, working on the Safeguarding Knowledge Production project on academic freedom, as well as research ethics for the humanities and higher education. So I'll introduce the session and then the Safeguarding Knowledge Production project, and then our panelists. So we're all here to discuss what institutions should do about silencing, what the role of institutions is, and the responsibility. First, to safeguard researchers, but also to protect research and knowledge production at large. So since the attacks on higher education and academic freedom in the last couple of years, specifically since October 7, we've seen a global crisis of academic freedom. And we're all here to explore the new institutional strategies and our historical experiences of these organizations in protecting researchers, and fostering collaboration and strengthening networks. So this session aims to create a discussion to share our institutional experiences and highlight effective policies and practices, as well as recognizing who the key actors are within this landscape. We've invited participants from diverse backgrounds and institutions, some of which are only on Zoom, but we hope to meet you in person soon. So the Safeguarding Knowledge Production project was a pilot project launched by the ACSS in 2022 and funded by the International Development Research Center, IDRC. It aims to understand the different conditions of production both in the Arab region but also in the diaspora, and the impact of such violations on the research project and the loss of knowledge as a result. So SKPP has been focusing on these questions of silencing and safeguarding knowledge production since 2022. And I'm going to discuss briefly the different modalities and the outputs that we've worked on. وسيم إذا كنت حد visual. So we developed a working group comprised of 6 members from the region and the diaspora. And they produced papers and case studies on different sensitive topics, from gender to the environment and the pandemic. We also worked on background research, which came first as mapping violations that a colleague that Jamil Bazi worked on. So he developed a database mapping all of the violations of academic freedom. It was not an exhaustive list, but it was there to sort of diagnose the landscape. There was also a database for organizations, so which organizations are safeguarding, where can they go, what are the resources that are available. We developed a database on resources, academic, but also advocacy and guidelines, as well as keywords that we pulled out from this work. And finally, there were 2 essays that we could use to consolidate the background research. A different modality, which was at a later phase, and my colleague Reem is going to discuss it in detail, were the interviews and the consultations. So we had in-depth interviews, one-on-one interviews, group consultations, focus group discussions, and it had lots of findings. He's going to discuss the institutional aspect and the preliminary findings from these research data collection. So we had the Istanbul conference in October of 2024, and it was sort of the capstone project of SKPP. It was a global consultation meeting, and some of our panelists produced think pieces on different aspects, including transgenerational experiences of academic freedom in the diaspora, in the United States, as well as archival access for diaspora scholars coming back to the region. So this global consultation meeting had different individuals and organizations, some of which are present with us today, all from different experiences, from different regions, including the Middle East and North Africa, but also Latin America, South Asia, and Africa. So one of our partners, the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa, unfortunately could not make it today. And they've been working on very interesting things. They had a conference in Dar es Salaam in early May, and April this year. And it was a sort of it was a conference to meet again and to rethink the 1990 Kampala Declaration, which was a landmark Pan-African statement to articulate principles of intellectual freedom and social responsibilities. So they met again this year to revisit the Kampala Declaration and to mark a return to the concepts of intellectual freedom and to renew their commitment as African intellectuals to the struggle for academic freedom. So I just wanted to say that on the part. Next, we have our work in progress. Casual baby electricity cuts. So we have some things that are still work in progress. First, the final institutional report, which compiles all of the background research that we've done since 2022. We also have the final working group publication, which our working group, each of the 6 members have published really interesting papers, and they'll come out in Arabic over the summer in a publication which will be open access to everyone. So follow us for that. We also have a publication on personal reflections, which is a publication that is very dear to me. So we released an open call for frank statements or reflection pieces from researchers, including students, professors, but also practitioners in the region and also the diaspora. And we've received over 50 reflection pieces where people, and it was all anonymous, of course, where people relate their experiences in self-censorship or active censorship by their institutions or by their governments. And we'll be publishing a short publication about this, which will fully be anonymous. And we'll be screening out some interesting ones that kind of lend to the visual, which will be turned into illustrations. Very briefly, the next phase of SKPP or of ACSS working on academic freedom will focus on developing resources and toolkits, so manuals, guidelines, to revamp our page on academic freedom and further provide these toolkits to our community. We also want to launch an anonymous blog, which would sort of be in line with the publication on anonymous reflection pieces. We've got perhaps depends on funding, a new working group that we'd like to develop, as well as a regional coalition. But these are all next steps, and I just wanted to give you a little hint. So, okay, I think we I'm going to introduce the participants. I'm going to start in order of appearance and how they'll be presenting today. So, Reem Judy has a background in economics and media studies. She's a researcher and coordinator at the ACSS. Abah Nissaka is an associate professor, of sociology and dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University. He's also a BOT member and a member of our subcommittee on academic freedom, rights, and societal responsibility. We have Nadim Khouri, international lawyer and public policy expert, and he's here to represent the Arab Reform Initiative as director. On Zoom, we have Laura Rovelli from CLACSO, which is the Latin American Council for Social Sciences, one of ACSS's partners that we closely work with. Laura is a political scientist and a professor at La Plata National University in Argentina. She's also a researcher and a working group fellow at CLACSO. And Vanessa McBride is the science director at the International Science Council in France, and she's here to represent ISC. And finally, Casper Landmark, who has a background in development studies and social sciences, as well as higher education, and he's the program advisor at the Norwegian Students Academics International Assistance Fund. Very excited to hear about SAIH. I don't know how you pronounce your side. So their organization actually focuses directly on academic freedom, so I'm sure very interesting insights to share. So thank you very much, and I leave it to, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, John, for the introduction. So today I'll be sharing some preliminary findings from the in-depth interviews and consultations that the ACSS carried out, and specifically I want to be speaking about institutional practices and responsibilities regarding academic freedom, silencing censorship, and safeguarding knowledge production in the Arab region. There are several questions that are particularly relevant to what I'm going to discuss today. First, what are institutional experiences with silencing censorship and safeguarding knowledge production? How do they describe their experiences? What are some challenges that they face? Second, what are institutional responsibilities to safeguard academic freedom, protect knowledge production, and knowledge producers in the Arab region, and as well Arab researchers in the diaspora? And lastly, what safeguards currently exist in the Arab region? What organizations can we turn to, and what are lessons learned from other global contexts, and what is needed to safeguard knowledge producers and knowledge production for future generations? So these are some key overarching questions that kind of framed our thinking. And as Joanne mentioned, the why now is very important, not only after October 7th, but over the last decade or so. The region has experienced multiple crises, from wars, political unrest, economic crises that affected countries in the region to varying degrees. And so as a result, thinking about what knowledge is lost, is incredibly important and was also one of the questions that we thought about. I'll briefly talk about the methodology that we followed. So for the institutions, we carried out 6 in-depth interviews with representatives from institutions in the Arab region that were either regional or local in scope. We developed a questionnaire covering several different sub-themes and focused on existing institutional mechanisms. With regards to the consultations, we carried out closed meetings with representatives from different contexts and developed a set of guiding questions, specifically focusing on not only their mechanisms, but their experiences, success stories, and lessons learned. So briefly about the theoretical framework that we followed. So thinking about academic freedom, censorship, silencing, safeguarding, we view them as part of a continuum a continuum that is overlapping, and sometimes it's difficult to pinpoint the practices that each of them subsume. Academic freedom and censorship tend to have more vertical exercise of power, while silencing and safeguarding may include more diffuse and quotidian practices. Not more negative, but more relating to the direction or the vector. So we also thought about these terms across different parts of the knowledge production lifecycle, from conceptualizing a research idea all the way to disseminating research and how they cross-cut across these different sectors. I'm going to talk about the key findings and give the bulk of the discussion to that, and we'd love to hear everyone's experiences and reflections as well. So from the IDIs, we found that overwhelmingly, the institutions did not state that they had a clear safeguarding mechanism or official institutional policy. Instead, they focus on risk mitigation in general, explaining to their researchers on their chain of the risks that exist, focusing on do no harm principles, but it's not something that is necessarily part of the institution, but mostly on case-by-case basis. Sometimes it's asking researchers on the team directly what they would need to feel more supported. Regional institutes rely often on local partners. Regional institutes, I mean those who are not necessarily based in the Arab world, but have a regional scope in their studies. They focus on projects with local partners who tend to know the areas very well, or what to avoid and what could be seen as sensitive as a result. In terms of the safeguards needed, participants across both the IDIs and the consultations mentioned beefing up cybersecurity, protecting yourself and your data. That sometimes comes at a cost, and it's not always something sustainable or they're able to maintain. Some mentioned donors because most of the institutions, if not all, were donor funded, Western donor funded, and they mentioned how donors should hear from the researchers of the countries they're funding and offer some means of protection, and not only equal support or advice, but having some sort of advocacy or push to protect researchers if they find themselves in a difficult position. Participants also mentioned that safeguarding is a social responsibility that everyone needs to participate in. It is not something that is only institutions, only universities, but also a general public, and it's important to frame it as such in their discussions and their outputs. Other kinds of safeguards that were mentioned were establishing subcommittees, issuing statements, watchdog organizations. However, not many could pinpoint or target organizations that they could rely to or turn to at the moment in the Arab region. One important suggestion that appeared across the IDIs consultations was developing an Arab regional coalition, something similar to other global regional contexts that can take on this process of safeguarding knowledge production. In terms of lessons learned from other regional contexts that we found from the consultations, first is the difficulty in measuring impact of interventions that promote academic freedom. What indicators do we use when there is something difficult in that process? Also, the idea that public relation and advocacy activities may necessitate a rearticulation of academic freedom to different audiences, and how we do that to reach these audiences was also a challenge for institutions. Internationalizing the discussion of academic freedom, grappling with it at the level of global development organizations like the United Nations, were some strategies used to apply pressure and to protect researchers as a result. This, some participants mentioned that this comes at a cost. It comes at a cost of flattening the heterogeneity of experiences that exist in the region, but could be one way of moving forward. And the university was seen as an important resource for many of global contexts, and a resource when it is autonomous and progressive. Maybe we'll get time to talk about that and how it applies in the Arab region. And there were also some lessons learned regarding the difference between collectives and institutions. So while some collectives working on academic freedom, they choose not to institutionalize because they feel the pressure that might limit their ability to produce knowledge freely, and that it might limit their ability to get funding, but at the same time they prefer not being in an institutional context. So thinking about silencing and censorship in the experiences of these institutions, several sensitive topics appeared in the discussions. First, in the case of Yemen, for example, we had one institution for Yemen. The idea of the experience with protracted violence, the collapse of higher education institutions, made all topics sensitive in one way or form. And grappling with these different crises becomes a challenge. In Lebanon, for example, issues pertaining to civil war, missing and disappeared, corruption, appeared as sensitive topics by discussants. We had one satellite campus, a U.S. satellite campus in the GCC, and they noted that what counts as sensitive depends on the context, and because they straddle two different legal and political contexts, managing these nuances becomes difficult. The participants also mentioned varied experiences with direct and indirect silencing of the institutions. So first, they noted that silencing is a more indirect and diffuse process, while censorship is more direct. And they experienced attempts to stop the publication of their research, newspaper articles attempting to defame them, especially in relation to their funding, arrests of institutional members, forced to relocate from, this was particular in the case of Syria, forced to relocate from Syria, eventually moving to Europe and having to rethink the structure of the organization consistently as more and more scholars or members of the institution are in exile or in the diaspora. And in terms of the tactics, they also mentioned tactics they use to overcome silencing and censorship, which fall under research ethics. So publishing under pseudonyms, protecting the identity of research participants, ensuring that their research is evidence-driven, robust, seeking legal advice if they're unsure about a particular topic, but some institutions mentioned that this is not necessarily something available to them. And one important theme that emerged as well is the idea of co-producing research with the local community and local researchers, and ensuring that they are involved from start to finish. And that way you ensure that the research is relevant to the community, but also relevant to their needs. And some barriers that were mentioned to research was access to the field, difficult for geographic reasons, difficult to war and crisis. Public dissemination was something that was also a challenge. Sometimes it would put the research, the institutional members at risk, so they opt to work with circulation. The idea of relying on local researchers who are familiar with the area community was also something important to overcome research barriers, and also language. Sometimes publishing in Arabic can be a big challenge, and it might open up the research to authorities who are able to critique it, so they choose to publish in English, choose not to publish on their social media platforms. So those were some tactics as well. Donor funding was a huge theme that emerged in all discussions. The institutions mentioned that funding priorities and donor agendas shape the type of research that they can do. They might not find what's necessarily relevant, but what's the hot topic at the moment. Donors might interfere in the institution's outputs and in the way they critique or approach certain topics. And it's important for them to think about, for the institution to think about trade-offs that they're willing to take. So when are they willing to compromise and when are they willing to put their foot down? One participant mentioned that negotiating with donors is still. Negotiating with donors was mentioned as a skill to master, and it's something that they've done through their work, their experience, and their time on the field. Another important point was between diaspora and local scholarship, and the fact that these organizations often work not only in the local Arab context, but also with yeah, it seems they don't like us talking about. Diaspora versus local scholarship emerged as an important theme. While some institutions viewed as the diaspora scholar as freer and able to talk about topics that local scholars can't, they noted that it's important to find ways to collaborate, and it's not only working on joint projects, but also more avenues for training, for mentorship, for talks and roundtables, and finding ways to theorize from the local context and not about them. And sometimes these collaborations may be damaging, especially, I mean, one participant mentioned that collaborating with Western scholars can sometimes be difficult if they insist on being principal investigator, if they insist on putting their name first, even if they didn't do the work. And that sometimes harms the institution or the researchers there. So I'll end here, but I'll leave some for discussion. Thank you.
I used to think some years ago, it's a very local issue, the academic freedom. And it's something related with us in this region. And now from the 7th of October, I think it's a global crisis and global issue. So we participated in common difficulty now because we have the same difficulty of academic freedom in Europe and US and also in our region. What we think in our council about this issue, how to recognize the key actors in this area of how we can contribute for safeguarding academic freedom and how we can thinking about this relation between global South-South and also South-North with the idea to generate actionable recommendation for this region and also for others. And we think about all this pressure now about knowledge production processes and their epistemological determination, and we think that there is many difficulties about the semantic grammatical issue, because now if you use some themes, some subject with some terminology, you become out of objectivity, out of naturality and all these. So we see from maybe 3 years ago that many researchers in our region, especially researchers who work on Palestinian issue, for example, like me, all the uses of colonial term, for example, it's become something like taboo. Nobody accept to use this, and you have all these problem of uses of terminology. So we see that there is many in many places defamation of campaign against researcher, pressure on the university by the hegemonic authority in Europe and also in US. And you know what happened in US now, all this process of exclusion, deportation of researcher, and I think we have to think in this roundtable about the self-censor, because many researchers in our region in the world think how we can survive in our comfort zone, how we can still in our university, and because we live in a very difficult situation in the university, the cut of governmental help and subvention. So we do self censor, and in many places we have faced to in double critique, because in many places you have this this power of knowledge production established in the Western and Northern university, and you have all these people who ask for the have money from donors and have international visibility outside, and on the other side, you have all these problems related in our region, out of course of this classical imagination about the culturalist approach. In our region, we have many problems and to treat some subjects, some things, but also all these mechanisms and relation and power in the university itself. So what I try to invite you to think about this roundtable, how we can network together, and how we can do some kind of campaign and discuss from many form, like legal form, how we can learn from people, how we can deal with all these issues that Reem mentioned about the campaign, how we can defend the scholars in the region, and where is the limit of our intervention, and also all these issues we have to think about the cohesion of this scientific community in our region and in the world. So I want just to finish to say that I would like to see practically how we can work together, how we can do a network, a platform for all these network for safeguarding knowledge and the freedom. Thank you.
Talk to you from a slightly different perspective, which is a research institution, I think that initiative across the region. And so
been thinking a lot about production of knowledge, safeguarding of knowledge in our region, but also what is the role of institutions outside of academia. So you'll get a bit of institutional take, but I also, maybe I'll be a bit provocative here, because I did like to speak about academia. But why is academic freedom more important than the freedom of other knowledge producers? Should there be a special category? Was there ever a special category for academic people in this region? With the exception of a few universities that have tenure system in this region, was there actually ever any special status for university professors? Or were they just either public servants, just like everyone else? So my challenge, I think, to us is to think, of course, you should organize yourself. Of course, you should create coalitions for academic freedom. But just think, if you are will stand, what solidarity are you showing to the other knowledge producers, researchers, the journalists, bloggers, the TikTokers who's also going to jail, if you want them to stand with you? Knowledge producing does not just happen. So the first question, I think, before we safeguard knowledge is how do we generate knowledge that is relevant to this region? Talk about the fact that one of the big challenges is the funding and the donor-driven agendas. I think perhaps the first challenge, at least for those of us in running institutions, is how do we create spaces, including financial spaces, to fund the topics that donors don't want to talk about. It also means thinking about, I mean, if we're going to do this, and I also, maybe that's a challenge to us in the room, is who are we producing the knowledge for? So one of my big frustrations is if you're just producing an academic article that is stuck behind a paywall, and to cross that paywall, it costs more than the monthly salary in most of our countries in the region. Me, as a non-academic, as a society, do I care that much? Sorry, I'm being provocative, but So for me, one of the key principles, if we want to go back and build broad coalitions to promote and protect academia, promote and protect knowledge production, we need to start with this idea that knowledge should be a public good. And this applies both behind the political economy, behind academic publishing these days, which means that, for instance, people like Syria have access to nothing that gets because of sanctions. I'm not saying that this can apply to Yemen and so many others. But also the same question would apply to us in the research institution. If we are taking the money to produce research that mostly goes into drawers of corrupt politicians or UN agencies that never publish it, why would society want to protect us or promote the right to research? We're no exception. So I think there's a real commitment to us. I mean, the first question is, this knowledge that we're trying to protect, is it even public to begin with? Is it accessible? Secondly, I think so, the question of how do we also create space as a research institution for research? And I would say here, seeing since 2011, we've seen researchers, it's been interesting to see the shifts. For instance, we host more and more activists who became researchers. The 2011 generation of activists. Some went to academia and got PhDs, but actually some who didn't, but who still want to reflect and write about it. So create space for these activists to reflect through fellowships, trainings, because they can be key knowledge producers to support them. But also academics who also want to also, I think, thinking as institutions, how do we create spaces as well for academics who want to publish in non-academic settings? How best support them? But also, as an institution, thinking about the political economy of that. What's in it for them? What's in it for us? How do we accompany them? And also, I think something that has become key issue since 2011, how do you build institutions that can accompany
exile for the many researchers who found themselves in exile and who want to remain intellectually engaged, not just in their new environments where they find themselves, ultimately in Germany, but they want to exist in that virtual space of Egyptian researchers / activists. So how do we create these spaces? Again, I'm looking at it from the lens of an institution. And the third point I just want to lay out, as well as a challenge for us as institutions, is who is our ecosystem? What is our collective responsibility for our ecosystem and communities? And again, I think we all know we don't need to spend much time about the neoliberal funding models, the competition, but how do we actually reverse that? How do we think about ecosystems of knowledge production, support each other, particularly within? So these are the sort of things that are very much at the foremost of my mind, for instance, when I think about our role. And I think what we've come up with is really 3-4 approaches. The first is, it's a bit like if you want to care for others, you need to start by caring for yourself. So we need to build a robust institution. If we're going to be able to protect and generate the sort of knowledge that we want, we need to absolutely build robust institutions. And what does that mean? The obvious one is we need to diversify funding. So you can walk away from everyone's going to say easier said than done. Easier said. Like it's about 70% of my time, but I think it does involve certain trade-offs, and we need to be very clear about it. So if you want to grow fast, but by growing fast, you're going to be dependent more than 50–60% on one donor, my advice is don't do it. Because if you're dependent 50% on one donor, one day that donor comes to you and say, I'm going to cut off the funding, you're going to fold, because otherwise 20, 30, 40 people are going to lose their jobs. And to be honest, as an executive director, you don't want to be the one telling 40 families, I'm not going to be able to pay your salary. So don't put yourself in that situation. Maybe you will grow more slowly. Think about the different forms of diversification. But developing robust institutions also means having frequent, regular, sometimes uncomfortable conversations with your board and with your staff. What are our collective red lines as a group? Are we willing to fight and die together for these issues? How far will my board follow me if I decide to make a statement? These should not wait to happen until you're in crisis mode. I'll tell you, for instance, Palestine, we had a big conversation. And what we came down to is we will protect until the end the right of our staff to say what they want in Palestine, including if we lose funding, under one condition: no incitement to hatred or violence. So as long as you're under the human rights framework, if some donor comes and says, you have someone who said, use the word genocide, you have to remove, say, no, thank you, here's your money. But if one of our staff members on Twitter said, kill all the Jews or something, saying, you know what, we're not, even if it's human rights. Conversations about it. Some people liked it, others didn't. It allowed us to sail through the storm very, very. So have these conversations, have them very clearly, and assume those choices, and assume that there may be costs. Secondly, I think robust institutions mean, particularly for those of us who are regional, and many of us are already thinking about multiplicity of legal structure. So at ARI, we're registered in France, we're registered in Lebanon, we also tried to register in Tunisia. But we're thinking always about different forms. So when we lost our access to our banking in Lebanon, French entity took the relay. If we need to pay certain countries where it's actually very hard to use the other entity, we have other partners. Think of it as sort of an ecosystem and navigating legal challenges. If you're only registered in the US and you work in Palestine, go register tomorrow somewhere else. Safeguarding also means, this is the lawyer in me, think about how you manage legal risk. Secondly, I think we've spent a lot of time thinking about our ecosystem and our responsibility to our ecosystem. And the Superman adage, with greater powers come greater responsibility. anyways, I think we need to think of our ecosystem and how we hold each other as our own way of reimagining financing in a typically neoliberal context. So, for instance, what are the power dynamics we are exercising amongst each other, amongst and yourselves, amongst researchers who may be in private, rich universities versus those who aren't, and be honest with yourself in terms of what you can or you cannot do. So, for instance, something that we have adopted at Pilot is we often the approach. We always share overhead in the same percentage. We're very transparent. We don't have the budget. Everyone gets, if the overhead is 10%, everyone gets 10% of their budget as overhead. But that's the key moment. We've also, again, collectively decided that we would put aside, to the extent we still have, some years we have more, but if you have any core funding, we try to keep a certain percentage of it. Again, it varies on years, where we support parts of our ecosystem that we believe in support. So when the genocide in Gaza began, and a number of researchers from Index found themselves, they had escaped to Egypt, no jobs. We took that amount of our money and gave it to them for their research. Of course, we didn't just do it as good Samaritans. We said we will co-brand. You put your logo. We will fund all of this. You do the work. We will support you. But what this idea is, as they become stronger, we also, as an ecosystem, become stronger. The third thing that we've thought about on knowledge as well is and safeguarding. What format are we producing the knowledge in? Often, particularly in people going through traumatic experiences, they're unable, frankly, to often produce papers, very long, robust papers. I'm sure everyone had it. We all get writer's block. After October 7th, I think most of us have. So what do? Can we think of different formats, different outputs? Obviously, we're not an academic setting, so we have no flexibility, but developing shorter format interviews, other ways for people to feel that actually knowledge is coming out. I think the other idea is in accompanying this, again, with this idea of who is producing knowledge. We actually decided that we need to invest more in editors. Because there's an entire generation. We actually track these things. We actually, every 3 months, I get data about who we're publishing, how many are well established versus those who are up and coming or in more, institutions. Because they don't need, someone who's gone and done their PhD at an Ivy League and got all their support. Of course, if I, compare the first draft that I'm going to get from them versus someone who was displaced from Syria during the war, who didn't get their PhD, who ended up doing a master's online with bad connection, started in northern Syria, ended in southern Turkey. We're not starting from the same place. So how do we adapt our institutions to support them? And how we keep generating funding for them publishers? So I think in some, I think we all agree is the knowledge that is often contested, increasingly by different types of actors, and those who produce it, all categories, from academia all the way to journalism, all the way are and have been years and years under threat. And I think we need to think about the institutional roles and the do so. And I'll just conclude with a point, sorry, and that'll be my last provocation for the day. As institutions, I'm particularly talk about smaller and new institutions, but maybe the same could apply to universities, I don't know. If I'm willing to go and fight for my staff, is my staff willing to fight for the institution? That's a question for the Gen Zs amongst us. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit provocative, but sometimes as an employer, I also have issues, which is if I'm willing to endanger the institution to protect your right to think and write the way you want, what are you willing to put on the line for the institution? Because it cannot be a one-way. So if it's only one way, then my commitment to you is not going to be the same. I don't have an easy answer to that. And it's not to say that it's the same, and it's totally recognizing power relations between employers and employees, between executive director and researcher. I'm not at all minimizing that. But I do want to put this on the table because often, institutions are also living ecosystems. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So I represent the Norwegian Students and Academics International Assistance Fund, which is kind of a unique setup. We were established by Norwegian academics and students in 1961. And we work for access to higher education, for decolonial higher education, and for the protection of students and academics. And you mentioned kind of funding, and we are actually, our core funding is actually from Norwegian students, who is part of their kind of semester administration fee that they pay, provide if they want to, $3, $4 to study, when 180,000 students are doing that. It actually goes a bit. So yes, we have government grants for our international partnerships, but the core is coming from Norwegian students. I wanted to just be kind of very practical and also focus a bit on student activists and their academic freedom and their repression that they are facing. We've been doing a bit of research and documentation over the last few years on this, and what we see is that while the most visible type of repression is often the state repression and the riot police and those kinds of images, what the student activists in lots of different countries are saying is that it is the actors that they deal with in their daily life that are the biggest barrier for their engagements, and that is often universities or their own institutions. So it's also about kind of seeing where does the repression actually come from and what's our responsibility. We see different types of this kind of institutional repression. We see what we call university lawfare, which can kind of be seen as a type of the lawfare we see on civil society at large, but the use of academic policies, of rules for campus gatherings, for protests, and so on, as a way to limit or restrict political engagement or activism. We see suspensions and expulsions, we see withholding of grades, which is not just targeting the individual student leaders or the individual activists, but also causing this chilling effect where students don't really want to engage because they're afraid of the consequences. And sometimes I hear kind of people talk about the state repression and the arrests. That's kind of the most serious, but for a lot of activists, the actions that come from the university is way more dangerous for them and their future. They can spend a night in jail or a week in prison, but if they're suspended or expelled or lose their scholarship or not able to pay their tuition anymore, or their parents back out because that's really hurting. And that also brings me to another form of the kind of repression we see against student activism, which we call kind of a relational repression, which is not only coming from university administrators or professors, but also from parents or families or others. And it's often linked to what we call this kind of delegitimizing rhetoric or different kinds of discouragement. This constant kind of feedback or input that students get in terms of like, hey, focus on the academics and not politics. This is kind of immature. You're being in trouble. You're maybe being a terrorist in the worst case. But we see that these types of messages and it's kind of attacking away on the social bonds and the social structures of activism, which is leading them to a very kind of isolated situation. This is being repeated and repeated from universities, from politicians, from local community leaders. It also leads to their parents, and we see a lot of student activists. I work mostly with Southern Africa and Zimbabwe, particularly where we see this choice of going into activism and going into human rights defender often also becomes a choice between your family, of breaking, away from those kind of social bonds. So I think there's kind of a role there to play in how universities can look at to what degree are we, through our disciplinary action, through our policies, are we contributing to this kind of repression? I also want to highlight a few, be practical and highlight some documents or some kind of tools that can be used by institutions. We were part of a UN working group together with the ACSS actually, developing principles for the implementation. That's what music in the background. It's nice. Developing principles for the implementation of the right to academic freedom, which is available online. And I think this could be an important tool because it clarifies a bit the responsibilities of institutions beyond these kind of vague ideas about freedom, and talks about the governance and the proportional protections and accountability mechanism. And also providing some practical guidance on how to address different kinds of threats and offer a type of benchmark that universities can use to kind of assess and see are our policies in line with international standards on academic freedom. And from our perspective, working along with student activists, we're also glad that those principles also include the academic freedom of students as a part of the academic community and their right to organize and to protest. And then I also wanted to mention, and I'm glad you also touched on it in terms of this not becoming these islands or ivory towers, but how to relate to the wider society. And, what we see is that especially now with the attacks on civil society, the closing space, the situation for activists and human rights defenders are becoming increasingly difficult, together with funding being cut for a lot of the mechanisms, the few mechanisms that has been there that have been offering protection for human rights defenders. That we do see a potential in universities and institutions taking a bigger part in becoming a part of this kind of ecosystem of protection for activists and human rights defenders. That is not just about our existing students and our scholars and academics that are with us now, but how can we look outside, whether it is in our city or our country or our region, to play a role. And we contributed the UNESCO chair at the University of York to develop these guidelines for universities hosting human rights defenders, which is available just like the principles for academic freedom, also in different languages. That could be an inspiration to institutions that want to do more. Several universities are already doing a lot, but if this is something interesting, not just kind of for the top leadership, but this usually starts with individuals, with some champions that say that we want to do something with our institution. These guidelines kind of provide tips and examples and guidance of how this could be done, all the way from how do we get leadership on board and how do we secure kind of institutional ownership, to more the practical kinds of like, what kind of program do we do and how do we meet them, and how do we build a community around human rights defenders or activists that we can host, whether through a fellowship or through different kinds of protection mechanisms. One of the examples here in that guidelines is a mechanism that we initiated in Norway more than 10 years ago, the Students at Risk program, where student activists from around the world, because of who are not able to continue their education or at a risk in their own country, can come to Norway, finish their education in a protected environment before continuing on their journey as activists and human rights defenders. So, so I think I'll end there and just say that I do think, at least that we see from our point, the protective potential of universities and institutions, and that they can be places of sanctuary and solidarity and social justice. Thank you.
So good afternoon there in Lebanon. Good morning here from Buenos Aires. If I may, I would like to share some slides to organize my presentation. Let me see if I may. Yes, yeah. So first of all, many thanks to the Arab Council for Social Sciences, and particularly to Setene Shami and Joan Bostani, for the invitation to participate in this session. On behalf of CLACSO, the Latin American Council of Social Sciences, it is an honor to dialogue in these sessions. And particularly, it is very stimulating to listen to all the interventions and the strategies that you are developing in this topic that is a strategic one for our council and in our region. So first of all, regarding, I would like to share some brief conceptual notes to position the perspective that from Latin America we have on this topic, which has a lot in common with many of the points that you mentioned previously. So the perspective from which we start is that academic freedom is the right of all persons to be part of academic communities, but it's also closely linked to a set of family of concepts. And one of them is the idea of autonomy, as you all know, which consists of free exercise of university teaching and research, but also free from external constraints linked to ideological, political, or economic ends. But in addition, in the framework of CLACSO and our academic freedom project, we also related to the right to science. They are to recognize the right to science as a human right, which implies access, as it was mentioned before, participation in science, and the enjoyment of science and its benefits. That's why we illustrated here as a link to the idea of open access and the open science movement. And recently, according to other international reports, we also relate the idea of academic freedom to the right of education, as not all the institutions of teaching and research are operating in our region in formal higher education systems, but also in outside those institutionalized systems or in more informal settings. So there we include also this idea. You know that in the Latin American tradition, academic autonomy has been a dominant issue, with changes according to a set of factors, mainly the role of the state in education and higher education systems, but it also implies a double perspective of freedom, not only as the absence of external coercion, but also in a positive way, in the form of the external evaluation, social relevance of knowledge production and institutional involvement in solidarity with the public responsibility that implies the political idea of autonomy, particularly in Latin American universities. Therefore, autonomy and social relevance can be articulated in this framework in a concept of positive freedom that is simultaneously legislation, judgment, and responsibility to mitigate multiple inequalities that we have in our region. So that is one of the strengths that some of our projects regarding academic freedom have in the framework of CLACSO. Therefore, consolidating research on academic freedom in the Americas has a profound significance for advancing the understanding and the ability to advocate for its defense and protections. Despite its critical importance for the advancement of human rights and democracy, these fields remains under-researched, particularly in the face of escalating attacks on academic freedom in the context of growing authoritarianisms in our region, scientific denialism around the world, and also in Latin America. So there emerged the need to foster research on academic freedom, and this also was reflected in the results of 2023 Academic Freedom Index, which point the deterioration of academic freedom worldwide and in the Americas particularly. Examples of such deterioration are the erosion of university academic autonomy, the judicialization of academics, increasing online threats and harassment, the lack of protective measures accompanied by the lack of adequate institutional response. Attacks against students' organizations are also part of the struggle for academic freedom. Various scientific denialisms, as I mentioned before, such that of the climate crisis, widespread narratives of discrediting public universities, and particularly research in social sciences and humanities. So based on this background, the Coalition for Academic Freedom in the Americas, the CLA, with the leadership of Camila Croso, and the Latin American Council of Social Science, launched recently a call for strengthening comparative research and critical thinking in the framework of American freedom in the Americas, with an intersectional lens, which we believe is important to understand this issue. Sorry, let me, here, this is the call. Considering the above context, 5 lines of research were proposed in this call, which are not exclusive, but it was a selection of areas to work on: academic freedom and the strengthening of democracy, academic freedom and the pursuit of scientific development, academic freedom and technology, academic freedom and university autonomy, and finally, academic freedom and structural inequalities. And that has to do with the previous framework that I mentioned on these topics. So as you see, these are the 7 proposals that are being developed now, and which there will be results on September of this year, some of the preliminary results. And as you can see, we have projects that relate academic autonomy with structural inequalities in an intersectoral perspective, for example, the role of Afro-Latin American research associations, also the idea of commercialization, credentialism, and political capture in some of the countries, again, academic freedom and inequalities, but also inclusive editorial management of open scholarly digital books in Latin America as a key point related with open access, non-commercial open access, open science. Also academic freedom and scientific development in Brazil, particularly climate and science denialism from the ultra-right movements in Argentina and Brazil, a more historical perspective on critical thinkers and academic crisis in Mexico, and academic freedom and relationship with democracy and inclusion in the Central Americas. Last but not least, because we open many in this discussion, many extremely important lines of cooperation and dialogue, we also believe that some of the actions have to do with the strengthening cooperation South-South and North-South in these topics, the mobilization and incidence in local, national, and global agendas. In some of the countries of our region, academic freedom is not part of the research agenda, so we need to introduce this topic as as a public issue and a topic of controversy. Also generate a space of dialogue, tools for change. I was very interested in Joanne's presentation on the results of the project. I would like to cooperate and to share ideas on those tools, laboratory policies on academic freedom, the involvement of different actors, not only academics, experts, some decision makers, students, teachers, social movements. Also, we consider that joint research goals on these topics should be a priority, and also the need to establish situated case studies, because in each country within our region, and I believe in different regions, there are some singularities on the effects of restrictions to academic freedom. So we need there to collaborate on research, generate co-production. I was so interested in the methodologies that you could enforce to generate these reports. I think we can do a lot to sharing these studies. And also, as it was mentioned before, to share that information, data in open, common, federated infrastructures that we can develop in a more open, democratic network among this alliance. And also to generate a kind of monitoring of academic freedom globally and in each region and in each country should be also a very important task to tackle in this conversation and in this working group. So that's all from Claxo, and I really appreciate this invitation to participate in this roundtable. Thank you very much.
I'm not sure if I heard correctly, but I think I'm next. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be part of this conversation. Thanks very much for the invitation to join you. I've already learned so much today, and I'll just share a few slides, I think, to explain a little bit around the International Science Council's work on freedom and responsibility in science. I think you'll be able to see my screen, and
Raise your voice just a bit.
Sure. Okay, so I think you can see the screen now, and just to say that the International Science Council's mandate is around freedom and responsibility in science, which in some ways might be more restrictive than across the academy as a whole, but also can potentially be broader in other ways, in that science is performed outside of the academy in terms of different kinds of actors in the public and private sectors. Okay. So just in terms of the vision of the ISC is to advance science as a global public good, and to be aims to be the global voice for science. And this concept has been raised before around what it actually means to have science as a global public good. And that means not just generating knowledge through science, but also taking an active responsibility in terms of sharing that knowledge in an open and inclusive way as possible, so that people can realize this right that Laura just spoke about, this right to science, to access that knowledge as well. And so we've done a little bit of work on what we think at the ISC it means in terms of the right to science. And we've also done some work a while ago around what these principles of freedom and responsibility in science might mean in the 21st century. So I'll skip this slide, but those principles of freedom and responsibility are really a kind of rethinking of the initial ideas that came out only after the Second World War, and a kind of a reimagining of them that we did through consultation with the IEC membership was around freedom to access education, training, and mentoring, freedom to participate in the knowledge production, the freedom to promote and to communicate science. And of course, those freedoms come with the responsibility as well. And the balance is that the responsibility is around promoting science in equitable and inclusive ways, to ensure responsibility in how we design our research in terms of them being scientifically rigorous and in terms of meeting ethical frameworks, a responsibility to share scientific information accurately, and a responsibility to ensure an effective and ethical governance of the scientific endeavor. And so besides this kind of normative concepts, the ISC also has a committee on freedom and responsibility in science, and they do a lot of casework. And so in this case, the committee monitors individual or sometimes collective cases of scientists whose freedoms and rights are restricted as a result of them carrying out their scientific work. And it can provide assistance in some cases where intervention might be required. Most often, the International Science Council takes the guidance of its own members on this, but it may not, its actions might not be determined by that guidance. And some of the actions that we take in some of these caseworks might be through letters. We might write a private or an open letter by the committee chair or sometimes the ISC president, and those will go to different institutions depending on the specific case. We may do some announcements, public comments on social media and on the ISC website to raise the visibility. And there might be, in some cases, we keep these quite rare statements or positions that can highlight these cases and act on them. And the goal is twofold. It's to do advocacy where we think that these cases will, we think that advocacy will provide some relief to the restrictions on scientific freedoms, but it's also to provide guidance to members through some of the principles and things I'll mention later, which I think we have in common with many of the other organizations that we've read now about the ideas of benchmarking or tools or principles for guidance. So just to give a couple of examples of the casework, I mean, some of the places that we've either sent letters or positions have been around the legal proceedings against the Greek economist and statistician, or places where we've raised the profile of detained scientists through social media advocacy. And I think in common with the other institutions presented here, we do see the Academic Freedom Index, you know, the restrictions on academic freedom really increasing over the last decade, driven potentially by conflicts, wars, and crises at country level, but also through political influence, and also through probably societal polarization and ideologies. I won't stay here for too long because I also wanted to highlight some of these kinds of guidelines that the ISC has provided. Sometimes major reports, so for example, around gender equality in science, or around science in times of crisis, and the Science in Exile initiative. And most recently, we've had a campaign around the ISC's interpretation of the right to science. What does that actually mean? And there's a kind of a nice poster exploring some of the concepts around that participation in the right to science. And then just to build on this idea of protecting science in times of crisis, you know, we see a lot of restrictions, as you've already mentioned, around academic freedom in times of crisis. And this working paper really looks at orientating ourselves as the scientific community to take a more proactive stance towards crises. And those can be a number of different crises. There might be conflicts in some ways, but they can also be changes in political ideologies or institutional collapses, for example. And in this report, there are a number of useful, I would say, infographics, and there's 3 cases. They show, they encourage us as the scientific community to improve our preparedness for a crisis so that, you know, we can be resilient when something occurs. They encourage us to enhance our response. You know, we're very good at studying crises when they happen, but are we really good at responding to crises when they happen within our own community? And of course, these help us to ensure a kind of a stronger recovery from those crises, and to maintain or to at least have a plan for looking after both scientists, the data, and the infrastructure that we need to make this more resilient. So I'll end there, and then we can have some time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. We'll open the floor for questions. Sally?
Thank you so much for this very rich panel. When I have a comment. First of all, there is something new on violation of academic freedom. It's a violence. I mean, those who monitor academic freedom since in last 2 to 3 decades, what is new in the last, not since 7 October. It's not about Gaza and Palestine. I would say there is a violence in the campus, there is intolerance, polarization, really, and we see it clearly after 7 October, but it's there. And just, for instance, many surveys done in the United States and UK, something when you mention where is the sensitive issues in the West, when we didn't mention it is the competing versions of feminism. So this is more and more, there is intolerance. There is a mainstream feminism that repressed other. At my university, American University of Beirut, it was a disanticipation of Holly Lawford Smith. It's a gender critically feminist by the students, asking not to talk, although she comes from the left, she comes from LGBT, but I mean, critical about certain. So I think this is really important. And to finish, this is to Vanessa. Hello, Vanessa. I am actually the representative of the International Sociological Association in ISC. Okay, so I'm so disappointed about ISC, all this destruction of universities in Gaza, and all this violation of a current violation of academic freedom all over the Western world, and IC didn't do nothing. And really, I'm so disappointed. Just I wanted to put it here.
Thank you for everybody. It's not a question, it's more sharing two thoughts on the topic. So first of all, we speak about academic freedom and we want academic freedom. Who wants academic freedom? Like not everybody in academia actually wants academic freedom. Universities and institutions, there is what I would call internal authoritarianism in these institutions. There are, even in the Western institutions, by the way, Western universities, we keep talking about the colonization and freedom and so on, but we are not free in our everyday life. Like our practice is very hierarchical and controlling and colonial. And this is on the level of the supervisor's relationship with their students, as well as the provost or the university president, who is establishing relationships with stakeholders that would harm the university independence. And the second question is about independence itself. Who wants universities, academic institutions, to be independent and therefore free? Because monetization has been part of being an academic, either in the Arab region, our region, or in the West. So, as assistant professor, you're required to keep, like, if your program doesn't have enough students to be stopped, and if you are a program director, you have to recruit actually postgraduate students to your program, and you go to the events and to recruit people. If you even research, like if you're doing a big research without, you have to get funds. If you didn't get funds and like use your entrepreneurial skills and get this project, but this will not be appreciated. Actually, what's appreciated and what's linked to promotion is bringing funds. So the more fund you bring, the more appreciated you will be, and then you get your promotion. And this is something people have been like proud about, bringing new funds to universities. Doesn't matter from where, we just bring new funds. Even the so in this way we find that knowledge production is linked to money, has been monetized from the start, from funding the research project until the publication itself. So my two questions were: who wants academic freedom, and who wants universities to be independent and therefore free?
I think since we only have 7 minutes left, I'd like to do Q&A directly so we can take as many questions but also give the right to response. So maybe Vanessa, you can respond to Sari, and then maybe Kafka and Abahir can respond to the so, and we can take questions afterwards.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think my response is actually very quick. I think that you know, we leave these decisions to be made at our board level around which of the responses will be a statement and which will be other forms of intervention. So they're kind of considered on their own, at the board level. I think we have, you're not alone in feeling disappointed. I think a number of members are in a similar boat and feeling that it was remiss of the IC not to make a statement on the destruction of infrastructure as well as human life through the Gaza conflict. So I think the first part of the question I didn't hear very clearly, Sally. So I'm happy to chat offline, or I'll drop my email in the chat, and we can respond and we can take it that way. Thanks, Joanne.
If Abahir wants to respond to Nuha, or if anyone else wants to respond to the question of who wants academic freedom. Sorry, we just lost connection on the screen. But yeah, but we can continue. questions in the room, I can pass it on the microphone. Otherwise, I look on the Facebook. So we have no questions on Facebook. I don't know if anyone else has any comments. I have a couple of things that I wanted to say, so maybe I'll just go back on the time. So, in response to Nadine about the academic freedom, and I understand that provocation and the provocative questions. As for ACSS at least, we talk about knowledge production. So we're safeguarding knowledge production in different forms: academic, intellectual, associational, professional, as well as scientific, which is why we invite organizations like ISC to these events, because we want to kind of do this holistic form of knowledge. But so I think knowledge production is just the umbrella, but we kind of like focus on academic reasons. As well for Casper, I've got a thought or a question. So how has student at risk changed since October 7th? Have you had any form of change in the dynamic, in the demographic? Can you say a bit about Arab diaspora scholars there, and how it's been unsafe in the West?
So just to start, so the Students at Risk program is not a rapid response to immediate threats in a way. So we work in different ways with both proactive and reactive protection. So both kind of supporting student movements, the capacity of organizations, protect their own, literacy, so on the kind of proactive side, and also work reactive, where parts of it is more through institutional partnerships. It's kind of immediate legal assistance or safe houses or different kinds of immediate support. And then we try to, both through the Students at Risk program in Norway, but we also are working now with partners in Colombia and partners in South Africa to try to build up more similar kind of regional mechanisms for that becomes a bit more long term, because there's an application process, and then you have to pass the academic credentials to get into schools. So that's kind of a longer process. And also, which makes it somewhat difficult in terms of huge crises like the genocide now, is that Students at Risk program is targeting, it's small and it's targeting individual students that are at risk because of their activism, not just because of their context. But what we do see is that there's a very big difference between different academic communities, especially from our European perspective. How fast are they to react? So in Ireland and Britain, for example, partly in Netherlands, we've seen kind of universities more quickly come up with like scholarships or opportunities or kind of, take their responsibility a bit more immediately, seeing what can we do. We have formed a coalition or a consortium among the Norwegian higher education institutions to try to coordinate part of the support for higher education in Gaza, but yeah, it's been a little slower.
Anyone else have any questions or comments?
No, I fully agree, and I was trying to be provocative. Of course, academic freedom has been protected in space and extension, but I think I really like the way you're thinking about it in South America and Middle East. Over the last 2 decades in our region, there was a sense increasingly of isolation of universities from their vital ecosystem. The most obvious tip of the pyramid, but not there only, are these foreign campuses in the Gulf countries, where somehow almost like, well, if you cross that virtual line, you can say certain things there, but you cannot say anything about it. And I think all the experience across all so many different sectors, these differential approaches are extremely vulnerable. And now with Trump, then the rules will change in these spaces. And frankly, who will want to defend these bizarre, alien institutions. If I was that society, I'm like, what am I benefiting from? You know, like it's outside. And I think that trend has existed in many of our countries at varying styles. And so I think the thinking of repositioning the role of academia in our current political moment is something that I think we have not seen enough of since 2011. There was a bit of an effort, I think, after the economic crisis, for instance, here in Lebanon in 2019, but it didn't go far. I upset a number of people at AUB when I asked about 2019. If AUB's mission is to mostly export Lebanese graduates to work in the Gulf countries to send diasporic money, why should I, as a Lebanese citizen, care that much about AUB? You know, I mean, because at one point they wanted access to their bank account before everyone else. A lot of people were very upset. My parents went to AUB. How do you say this? That's a great university. Like, it's a great university. That's not the issue, but I mean, you know what I'm trying to get at. These are moments where we need to, I come from the NGO sector, and for good reasons, we found ourselves isolated. So no one came to defend us because people no longer understood how we fit with what they managed. So I think it's a call that I think today is increasingly becoming more and more a task. You know, weaving together these different freedoms with each their particularity. And something very similar happened for journalist freedoms as well, where journalists, it took them a while until they realized, you know, anyone who's sort of working in the media should be protected. So broadening these alliances or concentric circles, I think is essential.
I actually only have a comment. This was a fantastic presentation from different people who care about academic freedom. I just want to add, because we also don't want to only identify the challenges, but also contribute to paths forward. What can we do? And I'm going to speak specifically about the crisis of Palestine as one of the biggest crises in terms of academic freedom, sovereignty of higher education, etc. So I'm just going to share that there's a new initiative called Academics for Palestine, and anybody's welcome to join. I'm one of the co-founders. And it's about promoting academic freedom and autonomy, innovation in education delivery, fostering sustainability, protecting and amplifying Palestinian academic voices. So it's all about sovereignty, supporting grassroots movements, and committing to decolonization, as well as empowering higher education institutions and fostering global networks and opportunities. So anybody who's interested to contribute to find another group of people who are working on these things actively, check us out online. Act for Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. This is Aaron from Swedish Development. And just quick reflections on one of the some of the comments you made. One about funding and the vulnerability that an organization has depending upon one organization's funding. I would just like to say that is something that we very much recognize, and we also think a lot about when we're funding organizations, because we also realize that we too, as a government agency, are dependent on what our government is telling us is the priorities at these times, and we worry that if we go in with too much funding for an organization, that we actually make life more difficult. Or maybe leave it at that. But I think that reflection was an excellent comment, thinking about how to empower freedom, and also your reflections on relationship between academic freedom and other sorts of freedoms of expression. And I think we have heard a lot about academic freedom and research, but the presentation from Claxo, I think it was very interesting. You mentioned the right to education, and sort of linking academic freedom also to students and the youth that are learning from universities and from teachers. Their research is sort of going into the teaching that's going on at those institutions. And I think that's also an avenue to sort of expand the group that is willing to stand up for the importance of academic freedom, just by thinking also about the students that are very dependent upon those freedoms for their education. Now, my last comment, I was in other parts of the world, in these discussions, oftentimes it comes up the role of the private sector and sort of reducing or shaping the scope of academic freedom. I was a little bit surprised that that's more here, but I think there are bigger things that you're worrying about. But with this too, we see how, especially when it's when there is a situation where it's not transparent who has financial interests in what activity. I remember working in Southeast Asia, how scholars can be very worried about reporting on something or writing about something that seemed very uncontroversial about a certain kind of agriculture, because there was sort of the lack of transparency means that there can be important vested interests that relate to that activity that the scholar has no idea about, and then it comes back at you later on. So with the result that scholars are very hesitant to be critical, because you never know where that sort of resistance is coming from. So that can relate to the private sector, but maybe it relates more to places where there's a lot of transparency. But thank you very much for this.
So we're going to close the session because we're 5 minutes late. We have to move down to
أنا حبيت فقط أعقب على موضوع التعليم الرقمي، ويعني احنا داخلين في تقنيات حديثة ونستمر إلى الريبورتات والأجيال القادمة. موضوع صون الأكاديمية، صون الحرية الأكاديمية، أعتقد احنا نحتاج إلى أسس جديدة وتعريفات جديدة ومفاهيم جديدة لكيفية أخلاقيات الحرية الأكاديمية. نحن نعيش في ظل مظلة بعض المصطلحات اللي لحد الآن لم نخرج منها في المنطقة العربية. أنا من وجهة نظري الخاصة، وهي العدالة الانتقالية، ويعني بعضها يعني كيفية ممارسة الفرد العربي أو الطالب في الجامعات العربية سواء في لبنان أو خارج لبنان، كيف يمارس حريته الأكاديمية في ظل الانفتاح، الانفتاح اللي يأتي من الخارج إلى الداخل. لا توجد قيود تحدد التعليم الرقمي، وهذا النافذة الواسعة الكبيرة. أعتقد نحن نحتاج إلى اتفاق ما بين الدول العربية على المفاهيم والتعريفات اللي تحدد كيفية الانطلاق بالحرية وما هي الحقوق حتى نكتسب الحرية. هذه واحد. آسف جدا، دكتور عقيل، باحث في جامعة موسكو الاقتصادية.
Thank you so much, Mona and Vanessa. Sorry for keeping you over time. And thank you for everyone.
Thanks all.